Okay, we're live. Welcome everyone to Watercolor Bootcamp. And this is day one, beginner day. I'm excited that you're here with me. So excited and actually pretty nervous. Just want to get that out there. And your body does funny things when you're nervous. Your heart gets racing, your hands start shaking. Just you never know. Often I get a tickle in my throat, and of course this is live video, so you never know. If I start coughing, I have cough drops nearby. I've got water. I'm hopefully well equipped as well, because this is live video and there's a lot of you here today. Just welcome, first of all. But if we for some reason lose feed, and it hasn't happened in years, but if it does, it will be today. And if so, hang tight. If you received a notification about Watercolor Bootcamp by email, we can email you an alternate link if we totally lose the feed, and we'll also make sure to post it in the comments of this video so you can track me down if we get cut off. So just getting that out of the way. Now that we have a contingency plan, it's probably not going to happen, so that's good news. While we're here, this is live video, and so you get the chance to ask questions in the chat, and my right-hand woman, Robin, is keeping an eye on that chat. She's going to keep track of your questions so we can cover those as much as we have time for at the end of the workshop. We are planning to run about 2 hours today, so if you have that amount of time and are able to stick with us for the whole 2 hours, you're going to learn a lot. It's going to just be a lot of stuff we're going to jam into your brain, and you get to then go home and process it, or be home and process it, and take your time to bring it into your watercolor practice, and just make room for it in your creative space. And if you're not able to join us for the whole 2 hours, I know life appointments, things happen for a number of you. I know I saw some names checking in from South Africa. It's getting kind of late in the day for you. You might need to get to bed. And if that's the case, this link that you use to access this video is also the link to access the recording after the workshop. So do plan to come back and watch the whole thing. As we're getting started, and I see the chat just scrolling past so many of you here today, welcome, first of all. You are very welcome here. This is a community of people who love watercolor. That's what I've been privileged to be a part of for the last 10 years. I'm celebrating my 10th anniversary of the launch of my first YouTube video. That happened on the weekend. And so I'm looking back and celebrating the growth that I've seen in my own creative practice and the community of artists I've been privileged to get to know. And you're a part of that. I see a number of names of old friends, people I got to know when I was first posting on YouTube. You're here today, so welcome. And newer friends, and some of you who are brand new, and I'm so glad you're here. My hope is that you see the beauty of watercolor, and also the accessibility of this beautiful medium, that it is something that you can do, and that is for you. I'd love to hear from you in the chat, and I know you've been introducing yourself already. I'm seeing names from Belgium, France, all over the USA, north, south, east, west, across Canada. I saw a neighbor of mine commenting. I'm here in northern British Columbia, Canada. And who else did I see? I saw Georgia in Europe, not the one in the States, although I think I have painters from Georgia, USA as well. And so just all across the globe. And aren't we privileged that we get to connect over watercolor? I would love to hear from you if you've taken any of my online classes. Feel free to speak up in the chat. Let me know which course that you've taken. Maybe it was one of my first courses. I started out with loose and fluid watercolor as my subject for my very first course back in 2013. And or maybe you've taken my most recent watercolor mastery foundations, which just wrapped up right before Christmas. Or maybe you're a member of my Heart-Led Artist community, and we're going to talk about the community, which is a monthly or yearly program that you can be a part of. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what you can expect in today's workshop. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about me, and I've already kind of covered covered some of that. I've been teaching watercolor for about 10 years here on the internet, and longer than that, probably 15 years or so in my community. As an artist, I've primarily self-taught, and truthfully, I believe that almost every artist has to call themselves self-taught, because if you never pick up a brush, you're never going to adopt the skills, no matter how good your instructor is. And so, we learn through lessons, online courses, in-person classes, workshops, and so forth, or maybe a book from the library. All of those have been a part of my journey. But we have to then go home and implement those techniques and make them our own and become comfortable and confident with them. And so, we have to be self-taught in that way. We have to motivate ourselves. We have to encourage ourselves when things aren't turning out. And I often see people identify themselves as a self-taught artist almost as though they're apologizing. And I really try not to do that. I think there's huge pride in being self-taught because we've invested in ourselves. We've done the work. We've learned how to coach ourselves through the learning process. And those are really good things to be proud of. I do believe that anyone who has a deep desire to paint can learn the techniques and skills required in using watercolor, and you can learn how to make art that thrills your heart and that fills your deep inner need for self-expression. I see that happen again and again as I teach, and I've seen it in my own life. I mentioned that I live in northern British Columbia, and I want to tell you a little bit about why that has impacted my journey. First of all, my watercolor paintings very frequently reflect my region. They show who I am because I'm very much a product of where I live, and the things I love and am interested in. They're things that I see every day in my landscape. It's a beautiful place, and I'm very thankful that I live here in this beautiful but remote community. And in a remote community, it's hard to teach watercolor, first of all. That was a disadvantage for me. As I thought about growing a career as an artist, I realized that in my small northern region, the field of potential buyers and potential students is not large. And in order to grow, I was very limited in what I was able to do. And that was why I started teaching online. I really always have wanted to share what I've learned because I get excited when I learn something new in watercolor, and I can't keep it to myself. And that was really why I started that first YouTube video, sharing what I was learning. I wanted to just spread the love a little bit. And I want to do that today in our workshop. Today, our workshop objective is to focus on watercolor technique. And we've got a good chunk of time to do that in. I'm just going to kick off I'm wearing slippers and I'm taking them off. I need to feel my feet grounded on the land. I don't know why. I want to talk a little bit about watercolor technique today. Watercolor is a highly technical medium, and that is often intimidating for new painters. You'll often hear people talk about watercolor being the hardest medium to learn, the most difficult. You'll hear people talk about the difficulty in trying to control watercolor. And these are limiting beliefs that can maybe hold you back from thinking that watercolor could be something you could do. While watercolor is a highly technical medium, and I'll explain a little bit about how that operates, we can find that it can be a really fun and rewarding medium to learn. And learning a highly technical skill doesn't have to be difficult or academic or tedious. It doesn't have to fly right over your head and feel unattainable. Watercolor, yes, can be difficult to correct. Yes, it can be hard to control. And there's all kinds of little quirks and nuances that watercolor comes with because it is a medium that works with water. But watercolor is, for those very reasons, that it's hard to control, that it's difficult to correct, that it is unexpected. These are reasons why it's so much fun to work with, and I want to show you that today. For me, as I've learned watercolor, the watercolor lessons, what works in watercolor, I found it also works in life. It's crazy. But the principles that guide my watercolor journey have also made my life richer. One of those aspects is that in realizing that watercolor is difficult to control has freed me from the feeling of needing to know every outcome for my painting, and it's freed me from perfectionism. And that helps me to see beauty in my mistakes. I think that's a pretty good life lesson. I also have found that in watercolor, when I let go of my need to be in control, I can align with my painting just a little bit better, and I can find a state of acceptance and flow. And my paintings are most beautiful when I'm not trying to control my painting, but I'm working alongside of it and we're working together. And I've really learned in watercolor that I can enjoy the process of painting in watercolor even when my painting doesn't turn out. And so it's about process and not outcome, although I'm always excited when I see a beautiful outcome as my painting is finished. I do believe, and I'm going to just stress this again, that watercolor techniques can be learned by anyone. If you have the desire to learn, if painting in watercolor is something you've really always wanted to do, I really believe you should follow that urging and bring along with that a quality of being too stubborn to quit. And I want to demonstrate today some strategies for building skill in technique that are not just powerfully instructive. They're going to teach you a ton about watercolor and how it works, but they're also going to be super fun. Now, I know you're eager to start painting, but before we get there, I have a tendency to want to dive into teaching you, but before we get there, I do want to spend some time talking about some of the things that might keep you from painting or cause you to get discouraged and quit over time. I see people quit all the time, and I don't want that to be you. I see people who want to paint, but for some reason or another, they find themselves procrastinating or holding back. And I don't want that to be you either. Maybe that is you. So let's talk about some of those whys, the little internal battle we fight every time I think I should paint and then I don't go and paint. And it happens for me too. I find that when we think about some of our whys, why I share watercolor, I teach watercolor the way I do, why I paint the way I do, and why I teach the way I do. When I think about why, it makes it easier for me to shape the way I teach and just get to the heart of why watercolor is so wonderful. I'm trying to ad lib off my notes and not doing very well. It is a pretty popular catchphrase right now, find your why. People talk about that in regards to almost everything. And I have found for watercolor that when I understand my core values behind my art, when it comes to art, it really does impact how I paint, how I teach myself to paint, and how I encourage myself and others. So I want to share that with you. I'm curious also, as I'm just talking kind of badly about core values. Do you have core values that kind of drive your own art practice? I'd love to hear your insights if you want to share those in the comments right now. I also want to talk before we get started painting about our giveaway. And I'm just going to switch the camera so you can see a little visual. I want to thank Hahnemühle for being the sponsor for our giveaway today. And Hahnemühle's provided paper for 4 lucky winners today and 4 winners tomorrow. I've linked in the description below the video the link you can use to enter today's draw. Do wait to do that till after the workshop, and I will remind you of that as we wrap up. Anyone watching the video live today is eligible to enter. We'll be giving away 4 of these Hahnemühle watercolor blocks, and this is the same paper that I'll be using for most of today's demonstrations. Here in Canada, I order my Hahnemühle blocks at Opus Art Supplies, and I actually have a doc linked in the description below the video as well for you that will help you source Hahnemühle wherever you happen to live. So that's going to be helpful. Any of the products I'm using actually today will be linked in the description below the video as much as we are able. By joining the workshop today and tomorrow both, we have a grand prize that we'll be giving away. for anyone who's able to enter both of the giveaways. And that is a $200 gift card to Blick Art Materials and a year in my Heart-Led Artist community. And that Heart-Led Artist membership includes access to 28, I think it might be 29 actually, online courses. It includes the online course or the online community, which is one of my favorite places to hang out on the internet. Hahnemühle is only able to ship to the US and Canada, but if you are not in the US or Canada, and I know there's a number of you here who are international, please don't feel like that excludes you from entering the draw. If we draw a name from a country that Hahnemühle is not able to ship to, I will make sure you get a prize. That is how we're operating this giveaway. I didn't want to exclude anyone. So thank you to Hahnemühle for sharing that very generously with our community. You know, when we have giveaway sponsors, they're not always able to ship internationally, but I am, so we're going to make sure everybody who's drawn gets a prize. So we're just going to move on a little bit further right now. I wanted to ask, and I asked earlier if any of you had been members of or had purchased any of my online courses. I want to just ask again, if you're a Heart-Led Artist community member, you know, we already have gotten to know each other through the Heart-Led Artist community, but do let us know in the chat if you're a member of the Heart-Led Artist community. I'd love for you to just share something that you like about the community, something that is a way that it has helped you in your creative journey. I wanted to talk a little bit about the community before we start the lesson, because as I know, as we wrap up today and tomorrow, you'll be thinking about how to direct your growth as an artist. And for me as an artist, I spent a lot of time feeling like I was kind of lost in the woods. I wasn't really sure. I knew I wanted to be better. I wanted to grow as an artist, but I didn't know how to get to the next level. And I really would have loved to have a mentor to come alongside of me and encourage me that I was on the right track, or maybe help me to set some goals that I could achieve that would help me to strengthen my weak skills, plan my course. And I felt a lot of the time like I was a little stalled out in my creative journey. And having a community of artists and mentors alongside of you is a really great way of structuring your growth as an artist. Over the last 10 years teaching online, I have created quite a few watercolor courses. Like I said, I think there's 29 in the Heart-Led Artist membership. And I've put them all into the Heart-Led Artist membership, so you don't have to choose a single course. I really love that there's a course library with literally hundreds. Robin has the actual number of how many watercolor lessons there are. There's a lot. And that Heart-Led Artist membership is available to anyone who wants to sign up on a monthly, quarterly, or yearly plan. It's something that you can choose to focus on for a few months and then, you know, take a break, or you can plan to use it as a part of your watercolor journey for an entire year and just see the growth that it brings. The Heart-Led Artist membership doesn't just have access to those 29 courses, but it has access to the Heart-Led Artist community, which is where you can share your work and what you're learning, ask questions about things that you might be struggling with, and participate in a lot of community art. It's kind of like an online art club where we grow together. One thing I've really noticed about our Heart-Led Artist community is it's not a vanity community where we're just there to show our best work and we never want to reveal a weakness. We're really a community of artists who are curious, always learning and always willing to learn and open to growth. And that learning process is very accepting of a diversity of creative styles. And that's something else that I've loved to see. I've never wanted to be an artist who just taught people how to be clones of what I was painting. Rather, I believe your greatest satisfaction as an artist is found in making the art that is true to you. It's unique, it makes your heart sing, and you love your art, and you become your own favorite artist when you're creating that kind of art from your true authenticity. Additionally, in the Heart-Led Artist community, members receive 4 online lessons every month and sometimes more, exclusive guest artist interviews. There's a book club that we do every other month or so. And we have online paint parties where you can come together on Zoom and paint together. What I have seen in the Heart-Led Artist membership, we've been operating for a couple of years now. And the artists who have been consistent in showing up, the ones who are painting and asking questions and taking advantage of the resources in the course catalog, these are artists who are growing in really amazing ways. And I've been privileged to see that for almost 3 years, just the transformation that happens over that period of time. These artists are developing signature personal styles, confidence in self-expression, and fearlessness in building skill. They are owning their artistic identity, which I'm so proud of, and it's really beautiful and powerful. So I asked you to share your why earlier, and I'm gonna try to scroll through the chat and see if I can find some of those whys just to talk about right now. What matters to you when it comes to your paintings? Why do you paint? What's at the heart of your creative journey? And I just want to talk about that here as we move on, and just look at some of your responses. I'm almost there, I think, scrolling. Okay, here's one. Brenda says, I have a core value to see and feel nature and demonstrate that feeling through art. It's an emotional connection through nature. That's wonderful. Here's another one. Pat says, I'm seeking creative flow as my core value. That's that freedom, isn't it? And let's see here. To create and relax and look for value in each attempt. Thank you, Gail. Core value, Lindsay says, don't let fear keep you from doing something you love and see and find the beauty in everything. Those are core values I share as well. The fearlessness I've learned through watercolor is a core value that I can bring into other intimidating or vulnerable moments. I have Sherry saying core values to glorify God, enjoyment, and bless others. Mary says, I enjoy the surprise I get every time I pick up a brush and paint. Sometimes I feel like as I get older, a surprise gets a little more scary. I don't know that I want a phone call in the middle of the night. There's a lot of surprises that aren't great, but being able to be spontaneous in good things in watercolor, I think it helps me to be hopeful for the future as well. Nina says, I've wanted to paint ever since I was a child. And that's, I think that's a core value as well. I'm following the call of my heart, something I've always wanted to do. These are great reasons, everyone. And core values, they matter. They make a difference. And I just want to thank you for being willing to share those. I'm seeing more things pop up here in the chat as well. Melody, it's going past, the chat's moving so fast. Melody says, I find art expression is very healing, and I have found that as well. Watercolor has taught me resilience, and it has helped me to not be afraid of the unknown, and not be afraid of my mistakes as well, not to be defined by my failures. And that's been very special. These whys matter. They really do matter, and they can matter from the first time you pick up a paintbrush. You don't have to wait to be a good artist to paint to your core values. And for me, to be a good watercolor instructor is also about core values. It's about a principle of generosity and giving with an open hand. For me as a watercolor artist, it's also very important to me that your growth is more important than my ego. I don't want to just be an artist who is painting wanting to show off how good I am, and that's what all my lessons are about. There are many artists who only want to paint a marvelously flawless painting and then teach you how to paint it just like them. But I have found there's a real value in being an instructor who's willing to not always know the answers, to teach, and also to teach from my why. I want to teach you why each step in the learning process, why it matters, and why I've made that choice. So if I'm teaching a step-by-step tutorial, I'm going to start with, I'm choosing this color, and this is why I'm choosing this color. I'm using this technique, and this is why this technique works well at this stage of the painting. You get why, and that gives you a tool in your toolbox that you get to apply to future paintings. My hope for you as we move into, we're going to look at supplies here in just a moment, and as we start to move into some watercolor techniques and practices, I hope that you can see that there are not just one right answer, but there are a lot of different ways to approach watercolor and to use it. So you can have freedom and confidence as you get started, that you will grow and that you can become the artist you're supposed to be. Not just a good copyist of, Angela's tutorials. We're going to really focus on principles today. I believe that a good instructor should offer her students freedom, and I really want you to feel freedom to take what you learned today and apply it to your own practice. And we're going to talk about some of this tomorrow, but I want to encourage you, anytime you're taking an online course or lesson, be wise about the instructors you follow. You want instructors who offer you tools that you can use and freedom to be the artist that you're meant to be. If you find that you are getting locked into a critical, rule-dependent approach to painting, it can be very limiting and actually harmful to your self-expression and your freedom to share your heart in your work. And I just want to stress that because I've been there. I've been an artist who was afraid to mess up and didn't really trust my own inner artistic voice. And those were years where I may have grown in technique and skill, but I really lost sight of what I wanted to express in my paintings. And my paintings didn't have a lot of life in them during those years. Okay, let's take a look at some supplies. And this is where we start, because if you're a beginner painter, walking into an art supply store can be very intimidating. And I want to share a look at just some of the supplies I would recommend for a beginner. I want to keep it simple for you so you don't have to feel like you have to spend a ton of money. If you already have art supplies and maybe they're not the best, that means you are free to use them a lot. Use them up. Have some fun with those cheaper paints that don't have rich colors. Paint lots of paintings on that paper that doesn't encourage your flow. Have fun with it. Use the time, take time and just use that stuff. And it will teach you. It just maybe won't have quite the exciting results that maybe the artist's quality materials will. Let's just switch the camera over and take a look at some materials. First of all, I just have a little basket here full of stuff. And so you can see I'm going to be rooting through that over the next few minutes. I want to just encourage you, first of all, to choose supplies that make you feel like a real artist. I think it's really, sorry, these are my notes. Great supplies will make it easier to paint and easier to learn to paint. You will waste less when you have great quality supplies, and you'll feel like a real artist. And owning that identity can be a really elevating thing for your artistic practice. So I just want to encourage you with that. We're going to start just by looking at paints, and I've got a few smaller paint kits. I also want to show you the very first watercolor palette that I ever had, and that's this guy right here. It's just a cheap plastic palette that I found at a local art supply store, and I filled it with paint from watercolor tubes. And I'll just pull a few of those out. These particular tubes are made by Blick, and you can find them at Blick Artists Materials. One thing about these Blick colors is they are full of rich color, and the price point is quite affordable. So if you're looking at some of the other brands that I like Daniel Smith, Sennelier, Core, and you find that the prices are a little higher, you might just find a better deal for you if you're in the US, especially from Blick Artists Watercolor. These Blick Artists Watercolor just are a little more affordable with some really nice rich colors. Now, I like to use tube paints, and I do that because really they are the best value for your money. You can also buy pre-filled palettes with the pans of color, and for some reason this one doesn't want to open. This one's made by Core, And you can see in this palette, there's little, these are called pans. And the pans have the same paint as the tubes, only it's been filled into the palette and dried. And so here's another palette with pans. This one's made by Daniel Smith. And the pans themselves are the same size. These are called half pans. If you were to use one of these tubes of paint to fill a pan, you're going to get at least 3 pans, if not more. So, and so if you start to crunch the numbers gram for gram, you're actually getting a better value for your money by buying tubes and filling them yourself. One disadvantage of buying kits is that you might not use all the colors in the kit. If you're buying by the tube, you get the opportunity to choose just the colors you want and without having to pay for ones you're not going to use. One other thing to note is pans are not, these half pans are not very big. A kit like this is something that I put into a travel kit where I'm going to be making small paintings on the go and using a smaller brush. One of my very favorite watercolor brushes, and we'll talk about brushes in just a moment, is this one. It's a number 10 brush, a rigger brush made by Escoda. And you can see how big that is in comparison to the pans. The bristles of the brush cover 2 pans just if I were to hold it flat. So that means I'm going to have a really hard time picking up just the color I want if I'm working with this larger brush. So for a small kit like this, I'm not going to be wanting to work with large paintings. That's another reason why, as a studio painter, I like to paint in my studio. I like to work a little larger. So I want this a bigger palette, something like this or larger, that I can fill with my own paints. And over the years, I started to invest further in, I feel like I don't have room to put all my stuff. It's going to get messy in here, and it's just the way it is. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Over the years, I invested in this large palette. This one's made by Robax.com, and Robin will put the link in the description. But this particular palette, the thing I like about it is, as a painter who likes to make larger paintings, I can put a full tube of paint in one of these little palette wells and have a lot of paint at my disposal. And you can see my brush fits really well into this palette. So that's worked well for me as I've grown and gotten a real sense of what my preferences are as a professional artist. You know, I've upgraded my supplies. Here's another little watercolor pan kit. This one's made by Viviva. And this one's kind of interesting because Viviva's very much, they really wanted this to be recyclable. And so they used a cork base to fill their pans. So, and these pans are a little bit larger. Excuse me, need some water. And I'll show you one more palette while we're at it. And this is one that you purchase empty and then fill yourself. And this is made by Portable Painter. Portable Painter, this is a beautifully designed palette that is designed for you to take with you when you travel, but you can use it in your studio as well. These two pieces come apart, and these serve as your water containers. And then they slot right into here. I'm trying to decide if I've got it right side up or upside down. And this one has been with me up mountains, camping trips, across the country. Then I flip it open and I've got half pans again, but you can see it's just a lovely little designed kit. This actually sits on my knee, so I don't even need a table and I can paint with this set. And this one I've filled with my own preference of colors. We'll talk about preferred colors in just a moment. And if you use the code Angela on the Portable Painter website, I believe Steve will give you 10% off. So how's that for a deal? And every time I open this, I just always just so enjoy how it's designed. As an artist, I love well-designed products. It just makes me happy. Okay, so we'll shuffle all this aside and talk briefly about colors, which I don't think is even in my notes for some reason. So I'll start by talking about colors, by talking about a little bit about Daniel Smith. 10 years ago when I taught my first lesson on YouTube, I did not have Daniel Smith paints. I had not experienced them yet. And when I started painting with Daniel Smith, I realized that there was something about these paints that really connected with my heart as an artist. They have a huge variety of colors. I think it's upwards of 250. They really enjoy using mineral-based colors. One of those is this hematite burnt scarlet genuine here. This one's a mineral-based sodalite genuine, zoisite genuine. All of these have little bits of mineral in them that give them a beautiful texture. And it was just a color that a brand that I fell in love with for the different colors that they created and how fun it was for me to work with them. And this little dot card is the colors I chose as my favorite Daniel Smith hues. And there's 18 of them. There's probably a few more than you would actually need in a palette, but I brought them with me on my recent trip to Italy, and sometimes the palette gets paint buildup around the edges, and then it gets sticky. It's hard to open. I should wipe it. I brought them with me on my recent trip to Italy, and that's what's in this palette here. And really enjoyed painting all over Italy. And now that I've been home, I've been using my studio palette again, and you can see these little paints do dry and loosen up. So sometimes you got to just place them back in. I think that one fell out the other day too. But the wonderful thing about watercolor is watercolor paint, it's really hard to waste watercolor paint, because all I need to do when I want to paint is moisten the tops of my palette. Just spritz the top of each color. That water will set on the dry paint, moisten it enough so that I can easily loosen up some color. And it just takes a second, and I've got a rich saturation of color to work with. And that's one thing I really love about watercolor. I've worked with acrylic paints, and it's so disheartening to take a few days off painting and come back and realize that the paint I'd squeezed out has dried and is unusable. And I know there's some different strategies for keeping your acrylic paint moist longer. So those are good things if you're an acrylic painter. I'm glad about that. But with watercolor, it's just not even something I think about. I can't tell you how often I'll leave the studio without putting the lid on this palette. And I know, whether I leave the lid, put the lid back on, or keep it off, I'm still going to have paint that I can use when I come back to the studio again. So I'm really thankful for that. Okay, the list of paints on the dot card. And if you're in your local art supply store and they have Daniel Smith dot cards, you might get lucky and see an Angela Fair palette there. They're not something that you can order online, but they have many watercolor artists across the globe have different palettes and different dot cards with Daniel Smith. So it's always fun to collect those and get an idea of what different artists like to use. The list of colors is actually available. I think we have a list, Robin, on the Blick site, and she can link that up for you so that you can see the exact list. I'm going to quickly run over just a suggestion of what you're going to want in a watercolor palette, and I'm going to try to do it without naming names. I know what happens when you take when I took my very first art workshop, I was given a supply list, and it had very specific colors named on that list. And the problem with that was that at my local art supply store, they didn't have all those colors, and I didn't know what to substitute. If it called for, I think, yellow ochre, and well, if they didn't have yellow ochre, I didn't know which yellow was similar that I could choose. And so I try to talk in generalities when it comes to talking about colors. So then you can start to identify a color by its characteristics rather than by its name. So I like to suggest that when you start painting, you want to start with, and actually maybe I'll grab a sketchbook just so we can try to dab a little color so you can see some comparisons. That's why I love teaching in my own studio. Everything's just at arm's length. So maybe you want to start painting and you want to be able to either choose a bunch of colors you can use right away, or mix, to get a good variety. And so I like to suggest that you start with a red, a blue, and a yellow, and two each of red and blue and yellow. So you want to start with a red that's maybe a bit of a pinky red, something that might be kind of close to fuchsia or magenta. And that pinky red is going to be really nice for mixing pinks. And actually it mixes really nice oranges as well. And then maybe you want an orangey red as well, or something closer to a true red. And it just leans a little bit warmer. And we would call that a cool red and a warm red. The warm red, I would say it's a little closer to true red, or you could start thinking of it as leaning towards like a tomato red. And then the cool red is being a little closer to a pink. And having both of those in your palette is going to give you diversity when you mix it with your yellow. And when it comes to mixing yellow, it's the same thing. We want a cool yellow and we want a warm yellow. And so I'm just going to grab I'm not sure, I can't even remember the name of that particular yellow. We're going to call it our cool yellow. It's kind of a lemony color. And then you might want a warmer yellow. And I've got a bunch of those, to tell you the truth. I don't know why, but I really like warm yellows. You could go with, actually and that one feels like it's a little bit in between to me. You might even prefer to go towards a orangier hue like this one. So you can see we're kind of going from lemon closer to school bus. And so we're moving from a cool yellow to a warm yellow. And that's going to give you some diversity when it's mixed with your cool or warm reds. Sometimes if you're mixing a red and a yellow and looking for an orange, you might be surprised that your orange looks muddy. And so by having a cool and a warm of each of these two colors, you're going to have a little more diversity to get a nice clear orange, or maybe one that is a little more neutral and isn't quite as clean. And we want both. We want to have nice clean oranges, and we also sometimes want to have ones that are just a little earthier. So this will give you that versatility. Same thing when it comes to a blue. We're going to look for a blue that is a little bit warmer. And I would say a warm blue, people never think of blue as a warm color. It's a little bit of a deceptive word. I like to think of like a true blue as being a warmer blue. Another one, this is another one that would work as kind of being a warm blue. You can see those are quite similar. And then we're going to want a cool blue, which is something that's going to lean a little more closely to a turquoise, or maybe the cyan that you find in a printer cartridge. And having both just gives you some versatility. So when I go to shop for colors, and in fact, we could even go as far as choosing a phthalo turquoise. Let me see if I have one here. Or a phthalo blue, which is, that one's a little bit greenish. But you can see we're getting much closer to aqua, and that's a fun color to have in your palette as well. Although a little greener than that other one that I mentioned. So I look for colors in those kinds of families. I look for a warm red and a cool red, a warm and a cool yellow, a warm and a cool blue. And that gives me a lot of diversity. And so you're starting off your palette with 6 colors. From there, it's really nice to have a dark. One dark that I like is an indigo. In full saturation, indigo looks almost black. Payne's gray also works, but yeah, this is nice to mix with your colors to get a darker hue. We also you might decide that you want to have orange, purple, or green in your palette. And personally, I do a lot of nature painting, so then I'm going to be looking for maybe a warm and a cool green as well. I might want something that's got a nice kind of earthy green to it, and maybe something that's a little more close to a spring green or a yellow. And that gives me some versatility when it comes to painting landscapes. I can mix green using this blue and this yellow, but it's sure a lot faster to go for one of these and then tweak it slightly. I can add a tiny bit of red to this green and make it a little bit murkier. I can add a little blue to this green and make it a little more of a true green. So I get a lot of versatility just working with this handful of colors. So now we're at 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. And that's a really good palette to start with. So when you're shopping, looking to add to what you have, oh, we didn't talk about brown at all. We should do that. This is a really good place to start. A brown that I like, and it's actually in, I'm trying to see, it's not in this palette actually. In this palette I've got Hematite Burnt Scarlet Genuine, which is a really fun mineral color. You can see it looks like a brown, but it also has a lot of texture to it. And you'll notice that as it dries. But a very basic brown, if you're just getting started, I would look for something it's more like this, and that's a burnt umber. And it's just kind of a nice warm brown, a nice neutral color. You can mix that with blue to get a nice gray. And so you don't need to have black or white in your palette. This is a really great place to start. So I just want to encourage you with that. Use your knowledge of color rather than leaning on those names. Sometimes it can, you're going to not always pick a color that you like to use. There are colors in this palette that don't get used very often, but I really like having them around and nearby for mixing. Some of these colors mix really well, and I mostly use them for mixing. Others I like to use all by themselves individually. So each color has a different job and different things that I like to do with it based on the kind of artist that I am. And I choose colors that make me happy. I choose colors that are fun to use in my paintings. And I have gotten to know that over time. You're going to be shopping for colors, and not every color you buy is going to work for you. And that's okay too. Sometimes a color that's my favorite when I first started painting, I stop using over time. I start mixing my own browns, for example. So I don't use this burnt umber very often unless I'm mixing a gray. And so over time, I've changed the way I use my colors. I've gotten to know new colors. Colors that I used to love and I don't use anymore. Colors I hated at first, and then I found ways to use them. And I've given myself permission to take a long time to figure out the colors that I enjoy. And when I start to get in a rut, I love grabbing a brand new color and giving myself something new to play with that just shakes up my paintings a little bit. So I'm hoping that breaks down colors just a little bit for you. I see there's questions about warm and cool colors. One thing I should just comment is that warm and cool is always a relative term, depending on how they're used in the painting. So it's kind of a general, it's like this, but it's not exactly. We could, both of these greens, this was actually a cooler green than this one. This one's a little bit warmer. It feels almost, I don't know, there's something about this that feels almost reddish to me, but it just depends on what other colors are beside it also. So when we're talking about warm and cool, it's a little bit of a tricky term because it is so relative. And that's starting to dive into color theory, which is, it's called color theory because it's a theory. It's always going to be very subjective. So at the end of the day, you know, it's always approximate, and there's an amazing diversity in the colors you can choose and how you can use them. So the best way to learn color is just to paint. Use up the paints in your palette. See what they do when they hang out with each other. And you'll start to develop instincts that allow you to use the colors you like the most and mix colors that excite you and are fun to play with. So give yourself the time to have a lot of fun with your colors. Get to know them. Okay, I'm going to slide all this aside, and we're going to move on to another aspect of supplies we should talk about. And since my notes are, okay, we'll talk about paper. I mentioned Hahnemühle earlier. They are our giveaway sponsor, and don't forget that you can sign up for that giveaway at the end of our broadcast. But while we're on the topic of paper, I want to do the same thing I just did with color, helping you identify whether paper is good or not, even if you don't have the brands that I'm necessarily talking about. So let's say Hahnemühle, which this is 100% cotton paper. Say it's not available in your area. Or you have to order on, well, if you have to order online, you get to pick the brand you want. But if you're in person, standing in your art supply store and trying to figure out which paper is good, it can be very confusing. The first thing I look for is that 100% pure cotton description. If it's not written on the cover, I can tell you that if their paper is 100% pure cotton, they're going to brag about it. It's going to be on the cover of the book or the pad or the description. So look for that 100% pure cotton. Cotton paper matters because it likes water, it likes flow, and it likes paint. When we start working with paper that is a cotton blend, and I have just this little one here that I was playing with earlier today. It doesn't say cotton on the front, but it's, let's see, 25% cotton, it says in the back. So it's a mix. Generally what they do is they mix it with cellulose, and the cellulose just doesn't flow quite the same. This only matters if you're an artist who wants to play with water. If you're working with a very dry brush and a lot of control, the kind of paper you're using doesn't matter quite so much. But anytime we want to work with flow and let watercolor do what it does best, flow across the page, it's really helpful to have 100% cotton paper. There's a few other things that describe the paper when you're looking at the cover of a watercolor pad or block. This one is made by Arsh, and it is also 100% cotton. It says it right there. They also tend to describe paper by weight and by texture. So this Hahnemühle paper, it's going to describe the weight right here. It does it in both metric and imperial. We have 300 GSM and 140 pounds. And that is the weight of a ream of paper. Obviously, this is not a 140-pound block, and one sheet does not weigh 140 pounds. But if you have, I think it's 500 sheets, that's how much it's going to weigh. And the thicker the paper, the more it's going to weigh when you have that ream of 500 sheets. So the higher the number here, the thicker your paper is going to be. 140 pounds is a weight that I like. It tends to be quite a reasonable weight for most sizes of paintings that I will do. I don't like anything lighter because it's going to ripple and buckle a lot more when it gets wet. Another weight I like is the 300 pound or 600 GSM. Actually, I think it's 640 GSM. But and it's a lot thicker. It feels like almost like a cardboard. And when I'm painting really large, sometimes I choose that thicker paper just so that it does stay a little smoother while I'm painting. You've heard me mention that paper can come in pads, like this Arsh pad, where it's gummed at the top. And so for this, I would take this sheet of paper off and I would tape it to my painting board, and I'll show you that in a minute. Hahnemühle and Arsh actually sells them as well. You can buy your paper in a block. And when you buy a block of paper, it's actually adhesive on 4 sides. So all 4 sides are gummed so that the paper is already ready to paint on. It's glued to each edge so that it will stay nice and flat as you paint. And you can open a block and just start painting. There's a little gap at the top. You can see this white space here. And so when you're done painting, you can just slip a little knife. I use a palette knife just under there and detach it from the rest of the block. And that's really, really handy. It sure saves time when you just can pull out a block and start painting. I wanted to mention as well watercolor paper texture. I'm trying to be quite thorough here. These pads are both cold press texture, showing it right there. And cold press is kind of a, how do I describe it? It's the middle of the road. And actually, if you're in the UK, cold pressed is also called not because it's not hot press, I guess. Sometimes you'll see people talking about their painting being on not paper, and that's what it means. It's cold press paper. So the cold press is kind of the middle texture of the watercolor paper. The other options you will see are rough, pretty self-explanatory, quite heavily textured paper, or hot press, which is pressed with heat and very smooth. My personal preference, and I think if you're just getting started, is to choose the middle of the road option and work with the cold press. Okay. The last thing I want to say about paper is that even when your paper is 100% cotton, I have noticed that in recent years there are companies that are selling 100% pure cotton that still aren't selling a high performing paper. And this is important to me because when your paper is cotton and it's beautifully textured, it makes it easier to learn to paint because the paper accommodates your technique and it makes up for some of your weaknesses as you're learning. I feel like with the cheaper papers, I've noticed they don't always dry evenly, which can be a struggle because you can't really predict what the paper is going to do as you paint. You want a paper that's going to help you learn, and that's why I stress trying to spend the money if you can on the pure cotton paper. I know that this is hard if you are on a tight budget. Some of the cheaper 100% cotton papers, and this is where I would encourage you, if you can be in a store in person and just have the chance to just look at or even feel the texture of the paper, that's really helpful. The non 100% cotton papers often feel quite slippery to the touch. They almost have a bit of a sheen to them. The paper manufacturers use a sizing to help the paper kind of stick together. I think it helps create a nice surface so it's not just absorbent like paper towel. We want to have a little bit of a finish using that sizing so that the paint will flow. But if they're using too much sizing, you might see a more slippery paper. You want to look for a paper that feels a little bit like peach skin, peach fuzz. Just has a little bit of a tooth to it, and you can feel a little bit of that fuzziness if you're just brushing your thumb across the paper. If you're touching paper in an art supply store, just the very edge, please, so you don't get finger oils on it. And you can also ask for paper samples. Many manufacturers will provide you with samples, and often stores carry samples you can try as well. But I try to avoid the paper that looks shiny or slippery and go with these that are just a little bit peachy. So do keep your eyes open for that. This good quality 100% cotton paper, you can paint on both sides. Most of the brands that I've tried that are 100% cotton, they have both sides are quite nice. And so if your painting doesn't turn out, you get a second chance. And that is one thing I would encourage you to think about, is if you feel like you don't have the budget for 100% cotton paper, this is where probably most of my art supply budget goes into paper. Watercolor paint lasts a long time. Brushes can last decades. So you're going to be going through paper. If you want to be good at painting, you got to use a lot of paper. You got to put the brush miles in. And so I would think about maybe what you could afford to budget in a month. Excuse me. So say you can afford to spend $20 on paper each month. Take that $20, buy the best paper you can afford, and see, does it take you a month to go through that amount of paper? These watercolor blocks and pads are a good place to start. The full sheets of watercolor paper are actually your best value as well. So I actually have more videos about paper that you can take a look at, because we could spend all day on this. You can take a look on my YouTube channel for more about paper. And I'm happy to answer specific questions that I've missed at the end of this video as well. We got to move on. Okay, let's look quickly at brushes. And for this, I have really good news, and that is that really you only need one brush when you start painting. And it's a little bit sad too, because brushes are really fun to buy. But I have 90% of my painting I do with one single brush. If you're just getting started, I would look for a brush that feels like a good size for the size of paintings you want to do. This is going to be a very small brush if I'm talking about making, paintings that are much larger than this. But for most of us, when we first start painting, we're working this kind of 9x12 size or smaller. And so a brush that's maybe a number 10 or a number 8 is going to be a good option. I'd look for a round brush that comes to a nice fine point. And this particular brush is a Sable Blend made by Rosemary and Company. And just going to moisten it so we can do a little bit of comparison. This is a number 12 made by Rosemary and Company, and this particular one is a synthetic brush. What I want to show you and just compare here is when a brush that has natural hair in it, and actually this is a number, yeah, this will work. Okay, so we're going to just line them up. This one is a natural hair brush. It's a Sable. This one is a Sable Blend, so it's a mix of sable and synthetic fibers. And this is a synthetic. And this one is a little bit smaller. These two you can tell are larger. But I wanted you to notice the shape of the brushes. As I've dipped them in the water and they've gotten moistened, this one very much changed its shape. Notice how full and fat it got. It still has that nice point, but it just has this like puffiness to the body of the brush. Whereas this one has a little bit of that puffiness, and this one really kept its shape completely. That is the difference between natural and synthetic hair, is how much water those brushes will hold. Now, the good news is if you're not into buying natural hair brushes, I know there are a number of you here with animal product concerns, and that's understandable. Although I would say as well that many of our brush companies are small family-owned businesses who are very concerned with the ethics of where they source their products. But there are some very good synthetic brushes that are mimicking natural hair. And this one from Escoda, it's their Versatile line, is a really good example of that. So these are just 4 different round brushes, and you can see that even between these brushes, there's just differences in how they're made, the shape of the bristles, and how much water they hold. So it does take but really, the main thing I would say here is it's really just nice to have a good round brush, one that comes to a fine point and holds a good juicy amount of water, one that isn't too stiff. It has a nice balance between softness and firmness. It just feels good to paint with, and it will do 90% of your painting. 90 to 100%. You really don't need much more than this. And I'm quite happy with, I can easily, when I travel, I bring one brush, and it's just as simple as that. So that's just something to be aware of. You don't have to be spending money every month on brushes. And, a good brush can last you for years as well. I'm happy to answer questions about brushes in the comments as we wrap up later on this afternoon. These are 2 brands that I do really like, are Escoda and Rosemary and Company. So I think Robin's already linked those up. So that's, let me know if you have any other questions. I always see people talking about the silver black velvet brushes, and for my own painting style, I just have never really been comfortable with the texture. They're very, very soft brushes, and so they're not something that I use. But, there are some people who really love them. So getting to know your brushes over the years, if I buy 1 or 2 brushes a year, next thing you know, I have dozens of brushes, and they're really fun to use to make different marks. But at the end of the day, these are the ones I come back to, just a simple, solid round brush to do the bulk of the work. Okay, let's take a look at the next thing on my list. Final look at items for supply. I've already showed you my spray bottle, really nice to have for wetting your paints when you start painting. And also I use this often to move paint on my paper to help me work with flow. And I like a spray bottle that kind of does a misting setting as well, not too forceful. And that's really, I always keep that nearby and filled up. Also helpful to have 2 containers for water. You can see that one is where I keep my dirty water. This is where I clean my brushes. And this one is where when I need clean water to mix paint, to move paint around on the paper, I'm going to be dipping into the clean water container. The other 2 things I need are masking tape. which was here a moment ago. Masking tape and these corrugated plastic boards. This is my painting support, and when I'm painting, I want my paper to stay reasonably flat. And so if it's not in a block, like I showed you the Hahnemühle blocks, I'm going to cut or tear my paper and then tape it to my board like this. The Corplast blocks are really nice because they're waterproof. They're very light, and I can cut them to the sizes that I like to paint. And so I have a variety of sizes here in the studio. Use the masking tape to tape my paper down. When I'm using good quality paper, I don't have to worry about the masking tape tearing my paper. That's another thing to mention. If you have extra sticky masking tape, you can heat it slightly before you remove it, or before you put it on, just press it against your pants and it gets a little lint on it so it's not too sticky. Little tricks that we learn in watercolor. So that really gave you a look at supplies. I'm happy to answer further questions about supplies as we in a few minutes. I want to get the brushes wet. Let's do some painting. We're going to use that piece of paper that I taped to my board for the most powerful exercise that you can do to strengthen your watercolor skills. And if this is the only thing you do for the next year, you will be amazed at what it teaches you. You're also going to be amazed at how much paper you use, because this is only going to take a few minutes, and then you can set it aside and move on and do another one. This is what we're going to do, what I like to think of as a warm-up. And when I come into my painting studio, I really like to start by reminding myself that it's okay to be here just to play. That I get to choose my favorite colors. I get to just do whatever I want here in the studio. The number one rule is Angela's the boss. There are no rules, and I'm here to play with watercolor. And when I remind myself that I can just play, and I'm just going to re-wet my palette. I wet it when I first came into the studio this afternoon, but it does tend to dry out slowly. It doesn't hurt it to have a little extra moisture. So we're going to just start by playing with some flow. This exercise, actually I think we're going to start with a little bit of the spray bottle on the paper as well. I'm just going to mist my paper, and I'm going to use a little bit of gravity to help me. I'm going to use my masking tape to tilt my board just a little bit. Maybe I'll back up a hair. I feel crowded. Okay, so yes, we're going to play. And I like to remind myself that I am here to play and I get to do whatever I want. I'm going to start with a favorite color, and I think we'll start with the lavender. And if you have a new color, this is a really good way to learn about that new color and what it does. Actually, for your benefit, this big palette has 64 colors in it. I would never use them all for one painting. But for your benefit, I think I'm going to switch to that palette with my dot card wherever I put it. This one here, just so we have a little bit of a smaller range to work from. And that way you'll know that any colors I'm using are colors that I mentioned are listed on that Blick shopping list. So I'm just touching in a little bit of lavender, and I'm touching it onto wet paper. Because I wet this paper with my spray bottle, it's not evenly wet. And the first thing I'm going to learn as I touch this lavender onto the page is what parts of the paper are actually wet, what parts are almost dry. And I learned that because watercolor is all about movement. The more water on your paper, the more your paint is going to move. And we can see that really rapidly if I just mist my paper with a little more water, and you can watch that color start to move. I'm working with a pale color right now because I want to take my time. I want to kind of relax into watching the paint. And I could use my imagination right now and start to see clouds. I almost see the wing of a bird. It could be almost anything. It's just a really beautiful open-ended shape. And I want to just enjoy that for a moment. You know, I started painting when I was 18 because making art made me happy. And if it's not making me happy now, you know, I'm not going to be motivated to do it very often. So I come into the studio, first of all, and remind myself that I get to do something I love just because I love it. Let's add another color and watch and see how much flow we can get. And this color is called Rose of Ultramarine. Let's try to put it on a little bit darker. And I cleaned my brush. The Rose of Ultramarine came off my brush in here, and then the dirty water came off my brush in here. So now I have a really nice clean brush to work with. And my brush, it has multiple jobs. It's a pigment delivery system. It brings pigment to my paper, but it also is a water delivery system. And bringing in that water, even just touching that water to the paper, can invite some flow. I can really get moist with it. And my brush can also be a pigment removal system. If I blot my brush on this dirty piece of paper towel, this brush becomes thirsty like a sponge, and I can actually use it to lift color and moisture off my page. So the brush has multiple jobs, and I get to take advantage of that. But right now I'm just here to notice what happens when my paper gets wet and color gets added. Let's use a lot of this rich shade of, this is a verditer blue it's called. And you know, I have past experience that can tell me which colors play nicely together. So I get to take advantage of that insider knowledge. And it's really interesting because I can't predict everything that's going to happen. In fact, I try not to by doing things like spattering my paper. But I get to observe what's happening. And in between each brush stroke, I really want to pause and look. What's happening that I like and want to do more of, and what's happening that I don't care for. What areas on the paper are getting to be quite dry. And I notice that because up here, for example, I have a very crisp kind of line right here, whereas over here the blue got very, very soft. That tells me this part of the paper is getting pretty dry, and I can use that and maybe draw more lines. Let's see. I could use that to, you know, make some crisper marks in that area, or I could moisten that area and soften things up. And I get to choose, but I can only make decisions based on what I've observed and expect could occur with my next brush stroke. So now I'm bringing in just a little bit of a teal blue. And there's something very, very meditative about all of this softness. I don't get to have a lot of control. I mentioned earlier water equals movement, and we're definitely seeing movement when a color is placed. I'm going to go back to our first color, Rose of Ultramarine. When that color is placed, it starts to move, and I can use gravity to help me by tilting my painting board if I want it to move more. So water may equal movement, but it also means less control. And so I can make marks, but then the water is going to decide how far that mark extends. And so working with wet paper, and I really like to watch it flow. Sometimes when I put a mark down, it feels very amateurish, childish, raw. And, you know, I'm not always comfortable with that. I would like my painting to look more unstudied, more natural. And so bringing in some of that water really encourages a little bit more of grace into my painting. And, you know, aren't those shapes beautiful? As these different colors have mixed, we get to learn some color theory. How do these colors play together? What works well? what doesn't work well. And right now we actually have a number of colors that work really beautifully together. The Rose of Ultramarine has blue in it, so it really likes to play with these other blues. If I were to now go in with, I'm going to do something scary. I'm going to add this very rich burnt orange. It's actually called quinacridone sienna. I'm so afraid to add this color. It's going to be a jarring note into this painting. So I choose an orange, and suddenly I've invited something very new and very different into my painting. And it's going to stand out just because it's so different. I can either decide to panic and maybe erase it with a little water. I can start to blend it into the rest of the painting. Or I could have taken more of that quinacridone sienna and brought it into other parts of the painting, so this area didn't feel so different. But every decision I make has an impact on my painting. And so I feel like every decision I make gets a little minimized when I start to spray it with water. And this is another reason I like 100% cotton paper. I can use a lot of water, and I can spend a long time just touching in color, watching what it does, being observant. And something that's happening over here with the quinacridone sienna is I'm getting this very interesting, unnameable color. I don't know how I would describe this color. I can see kind of a grayish hue, but I can also see the orange. I can see the pink. I can see the blue. It's really, really interesting. I don't know if you can see that kind of nuance of color with any other art medium. Watercolor is so unique in how transparent it is and the different textures that those layers can be. You know, it's just really, really fascinating how that works. And I'm also noticing that the Rose of Ultramarine plays better with the orange than the blue did. I really actually like, that's something I know about myself from past painting experiences, is that I like the combination of orange and a reddish violet. And so we get to see that with the combination of the quinacridone sienna and the Rose of Ultramarine. Now, as I've been talking and demonstrating, again, parts of the painting are changing. We've got this very moist area, but over here I've been able to put marks that kind of hold a bit more of their own identity. And so we get to see some really pretty soft shapes and some colors that are going to flow just a little bit less. And my powers of observation, the more I do this, the more I become able to anticipate when it's a good time to make a crisp mark on a wet piece of paper and when that mark will just disappear into flow because things are too wet. This is just this is just learning process, learning to anticipate what's going to happen as the paper is drying. And this is why I talk about this wet and wet flow exercise as being so powerful. Wet your paper, drop in a color, notice what it does. Drop in another color, notice what it does. And move back and forth. Wet your paper and notice how you can make colors move. Certain colors won't move very well. Some will stain. There's a really pretty rainbow happening here. I had a question about the oatmeal effect, and you're right, there's some real texture happening. And I will zoom in so you can see that. Not there so much, but over on this side, we're really seeing some texture happening. And some colors do this. The texture of the paper is why we see kind of that textural effect right now. We've got little grains of pigment settling into that cold pressed texture of the paper. Some colors we call them sedimentary or granulating colors, and those little pigment particles kind of flock together into the low spots on the paper, and that's why we see that textural effect. Watercolor is almost always flat. Unlike oil paint or acrylic paint where you can layer thick blobs of paint, we don't do that in watercolor. So texture is always an illusion. And so I like that. I look at this and I see some really beautiful textures that are happening, very subtle textures that are happening as the paint does what it does. I believe the main reason we're getting that texture is the Rose of Ultramarine has ultramarine blue in it, and ultramarine blue is really known for doing that and creating that kind of texture. I might be getting it from the Verditer blue as well. I think this is a really pretty exercise into flow. I'm quite happy with it, and I'm going to let it dry, and then tomorrow I can come back and I can develop this and learn another watercolor technique. So I just want to talk again about this exercise. It is funny because I think a lot of times if you're painting and doing these wet and wet exercises, you feel as if you're doing something that is kind of gratuitous. It's kind of fun, but really what's the point? And how is it making me a better painter? It is making you a better painter in a lot of ways. I'm just going to list a few. Wet and wet painting teaches us water ratios, how much water to use, and how long things take to dry. And that's going to be dependent on your climate as well. So it's not just about observing what somebody else is doing. It's about noticing how the paint flows for you in your little microsystem where you live. You get to notice how long something takes to dry, and how sometimes you might touch your brush to the paper at exactly the wrong moment. If I'm putting water on my paper right now, at this stage of the drying stage, it's going to create blooms, and you can see the texture that just spattering with a wet brush created because my paper is kind of at an interesting stage of absorbency. Wanting to come in and make marks with my brush right now might create more problems than it solves. It might create some very demanding areas that the eye wants to gravitate to. I also get to learn pigment ratios, how much paint should be on my brush to get a nice translucent wash of color, how much paint should be on my brush to get darker shapes on the page, how much paint should be on my brush to create contrast with what's already happening. And we can learn that as we play with wet and wet. You can learn brush water load. Like I mentioned, your brush can add water or paint to the paper, or it can absorb water or paint like a sponge. And so you get to develop a sixth sense for how wet your brush should be. We learn color theory and how colors work together, and how the addition of one color can change the whole direction of your painting. We can also develop strength in composition, in making a strong painting that has interesting areas to look at and quiet spaces that draw attention to those interesting areas. That's really what a good composition does, is it gives your eye a journey that you go on as you look through the painting. And when you're working with wet and wet and playing with shape and color, because I don't have a reference photo I'm looking at, I just get to create something that has pleasing shapes. And it gives me a little bit of freedom to develop my creative style. I also learned the principle of presence, being fully present to notice what's happening on the paper with every brush stroke. And it's very important to me to kind of lose track of time and just focus on the painting. What's happening right now? What do I think is a logical next step? So often when I come to paint, I'm fighting a battle with my expectations. I had an idea for what I wanted my painting to look like, and with the first brush stroke, my painting changes, and I have to now change my plan. And so practicing just this sense of being fully present in the moment, it really helps me to align with my painting and come alongside of it. I'm developing my sense of timing for watercolor and watercolor techniques. And I just find it so fascinating that this exercise, the easiest, most open-ended exercise you could do in watercolor, wetting your paper and dropping color in and just taking the time to notice what happens, this is an exercise that I think has the most to teach you. It's an easy win, and whether or not the painting turns out to look like something, you're developing valuable watercolor technique skills, and they're going to pay off in the long run, and I think that's so exciting. I would really encourage you to think about this exercise as a drill. If you're a pianist and you've spent any time developing your fingering, you know that drills are really important to build finger strength and to get that speed on the piano. I've heard my daughter practice her drills, her finger exercises for years. And those exercises, those drills, they don't have a powerful outcome. They're not about creating a song in that moment. They're just exercises. And this is an exercise as well. So whether or not you have an outcome you like, you're doing the same thing. You're doing drills that make your painting stronger. Give yourself permission to practice. This painting has a second side, so if I want to, I can flip it over after it's dry and do another one. And, I like to think about, have I set a deadline for my ability to grow skill in watercolor? If it takes, what if it took 100 paintings for me to start to become comfortable with one technique? Can I give myself permission to ruin 100 paintings so that I can learn that new skill? Can I give myself permission to ruin 1,000 paintings before I make a great piece of art? What criteria am I willing to set for myself in order to grow as an artist? And one criteria for me is let's make it fun. If I can make learning fun, I know I'm going to keep learning and keep moving forward. I want to show you a couple of ways that I've used this wet and wet style of painting in a practical painting process. And one of those is an exercise from my course, Learn Watercolor the Heart-Led Way. So let's just switch over and I'll grab those paintings. So wet and wet painting can be a foundation for your larger paintings. I'll just zoom out so we can actually see. This painting started out as a wet and wet underpainting. And this is a fun little local landscape. I really enjoyed connecting the sky and the water and just this little watery feel. And I really, as much as I wanted to put more details in, I was just falling in love with all the little watermarks. And so that just made me happy. But it started out as a wet and wet underpainting. The whole thing was wet. The shapes were created as, that first layer was a placeholder for where everything else was going to go. Wet and wet doesn't have to just fill your whole page either. Your wet and wet painting might just be a part of the painting. In my course, Learn Watercolor the Heart-Led Way, which we're doing as a live interactive series through the month of February, Robin's going to link up the course. It's a really good next step if you're a new painter. This is one of the lessons from that course. And we used wet and wet painting to add all kinds of beautiful color into the shapes of these figs. And it was so much fun to do. I think about this painting a lot because it makes me so happy. And we're seeing that combination of purple and kind of an orangey red again. And wet painting can be the foundation for excuse me, a vibrant watercolor sky. Like this painting, which is from my Winter Landscapes course, which is a part of the Heart-Led Community Bundle. And I have a tutorial on how I'm just walking you through creating that beautiful, a little bit exaggerated Northern Lights scene. Wet and wet painting can also help you develop your negative painting skills. Here we've used wet and wet painting and negative painting. And I think we'll have time to do a little negative painting demonstration here. We've got time for that as well. You start with that negative underpainting or that wet and wet underpainting, and then I built my leaves up over top of this. And a wet and wet underpainting can create a floral painting as well. And we start with that wet and wet wash, a very loose shape of the blues to show where the flowers go, and then negative painting to build up the shapes of the flowers. And this is from my Sun, Snow, and Flowers course, which is also a part of the Heart-Led Artist Bundle. I wanted to share this because I see so many applications for a wet and wet underpainting. And here's another underpainting I did this morning. I'm just playing with some favorite colors. And you can see there's little watermark areas where we have a paper that's not evenly wet. You know, it's a little bit drier here, so we get this edge that's created. It was a little bit drier here, so another edge happened. I used darker, thicker pigment here to make this dark mark. This is a little bit of pure pigment in the turquoise as well. So we create a first layer. This is really an underpainting for whatever I want to do next. And I'm really needing some water. And when I have these wet and wet first layers, I get to decide, I get to learn, walk myself through making them into something. I want to create some beautiful shapes out of this loose, could be a floral maybe. So let's just play with that a little bit. Watercolor is very unique in that most watercolor artists do not use white paint. White paint tends to look a little chalky in a watercolor painting. And since watercolor is transparent, we can use our paper as our white. And so anything that's light here, any areas where I want to feel like they're glowing or lit or lighter, I need to not touch them with my brush once I get those initial shapes down. And so using my brush, I now need to start painting around some of the shapes. And I'm going to start with my green, I think, and just give you a very brief demonstration of negative painting. We call it negative painting because it's like a photographic negative in which you're it's a reverse technique. You're painting around the shapes you want to develop. So let's say this is a flower here. And I actually have a flower that would work. Robin sent me flowers the other day, and I'm going to paint them now, Robin. Just that's spur of the moment, isn't it? So this alstroemeria has a beautiful kind of bell-like shape. We're going to imagine that this is kind of a bit of a purple alstroemeria. So I'm just going to paint around that shape and define a petal. And it's a painting, so it's not a photograph, so it doesn't need to be precise. But we just want to suggest that maybe something that maybe could be a flower. And maybe, if you know your flowers really well, you might even see an alstroemeria there. I just need a piece of fresh paper towel because often my paintbrush is a little bit wetter than I'd like, and sometimes you just want to dab off that extra bit of water with your brush. So I've just shaped that flower, and I'm going to just paint a little bit of shape inside the flower. So I just negative painted around the shape of the flower, and then I just positive painted alongside of it. So a little bit of both going on right there. Let's touch in a little bit of a brighter pink just to make it sing, I don't know. I can use my green to paint a leaf as well, and this is a wet area from my negative painting, so I'm going to actually define a softer leaf. And people aren't going to know that that happened in the second layer. It's kind of fun, blending two techniques together. Now I like this created an edge. My green paint shaping that flower created a crisp edge. We call that a hard edge. I kind of want to soften that edge a little bit and have it kind of come and go a little bit. If it's too crisp, then my flower might look a little stiff. So I'm just going to moisten that edge right here with my brush. And I might even drop a little bit of my purpley color. This is a hue called Wisteria. And let a little bit of that wisteria flow in. And that's just a little bit of a come and go kind of shape happening there. Now, if I'm thinking about flowers, and maybe this is a flower arrangement, I have to also decide what I'm going to do with that turquoise. But the good news is I don't have to decide today. Now, I know you want me to decide today because you're here today. But I don't really know what to do with it. And so I'm going to give myself permission, because this is my studio and I get to be the boss. And that's the thing I always want to remind myself. I get to decide. So if I'm not really sure what to do, my decision is that I get to wait. And so I'm going to work over here and draw around with my brush another of these Alstroemeria blossoms. And it's the approximate shape. Because my wet and wet beginning, that first layer, my underpainting, is very, very soft, everything flowed together, I can use my imagination a little bit. So up here, there's not really very much of the wisteria color, but I can still imagine the flower shape moving outward. I'm just going to soften with my brush and let some of that green flow. And that's quite a pretty little shape. So I just get to play with discovering shapes in my painting. We'll do one more. And I think we'll take this spatter here. I'm almost thinking that would be like a lilac rather than the Alstroemeria. Let's see if we can't try to hint at a lilac. Problem with the lilac is it's got a lot of tiny little fussy blossoms. So this is where we have to be imaginative. And all that I'm doing is just drawing around the shapes that I'm imagining. A lilac's going to be kind of if I was to outline around a lilac, it would be kind of bumpy like that. So it might be a lilac, it might be another kind of flower with a lot of little spots, bumpy edges. But suddenly I'm starting to see some flowers emerge in my painting. And I keep going slowly as I get ideas for what else could be happening on the paper. And I think I'm often teaching students, both beginner and intermediate, who want to develop their negative painting skills. I have a lot of floral courses in the Heartlit Artist community where we talk about this. But, and there's some positive painting inside the shape instead of around the shape. The biggest thing that I see is we get anxious. We're not really sure what to do next. And instead of waiting till we get an insight, we try to rush ahead. And that generally involves, like a rushed idea is often not a very good idea. So I really like to slow down, practice my skills of observation and my ability to be present, and just leaning into noticing what's happening on the paper and where do I think I could go next. And each of those small little decisions, they add up. And so I get to keep playing with this over time. I don't get to finish it today. I'm sorry about that. But I wanted to demonstrate this just because negative painting is a small piece of technique. It's we start with wet and wet, then we start finding shapes and drawing around them, drawing inside of them, and that's really all there is to it. That's the foundation of watercolor painting. Now, I'm hoping that you're thinking about taking this a step further and continuing to grow your skills. As I should just mention, I have already outlined what working wet and wet teaches us. Working with negative painting like this teaches us about edges. We drew that nice crisp edge and then I softened it and brought paint in. Over here we made an interesting edge to suggest this lilac shape. We get to play with all of those edges that define form, and softening them in places helps unite the different shapes in the painting. We are also working to further our skills in composition and design, what brings balance to the painting, where these different shapes should go. And we are continuing to work with color theory, choosing colors, learning how to layer colors, and build up contrasts by enriching our darks. So there's a lot of skill that's happening, even in fiddling with something like this. Whether or not this turns out, I know that I'm building skill and adding new strategies to my toolbox of techniques that I can use. So, really what you're seeing here as I've demonstrated Sorry, I have a cough drop because my throat's getting tickly. You know, as I've demonstrated, what you're learning here is that you're teaching yourself. You're the only one, because the amazing thing is, okay, I have to get rid of this cough drop because I just can't even talk anymore. Okay, that was embarrassing. Okay, yes, I'm a flawed human being with a tickly throat. And my paintings aren't perfect either, but you know that everyone teaches me something. I am so thankful for just the fact that every time I paint, I'm bringing to life something that never existed before. And with watercolor, it's truly unique, especially if you're working wet and wet. You wet your paper, you drop in color, and whoa, it's unique. It's like a snowflake. You know, you can never do it again. You get to make something unique every time, and you get to be a witness to the beauty as it unfolds on your paper. You're teaching yourself how to paint because no one can tell you when you've got that unique snowflake in front of you. You're the only one who can decide what it needs, what the next step should be. And you're building your skill in doing that as you play with watercolor. Watercolor is a skill that can be learned. And you know, one thing that happens is as you start to practice this model of presence, you start to see that you can trust your instincts when it comes to decisions about color and style and composition. And that's why it's so important to me that we teach watercolor in a way that gives you room to trust yourself and make your own decisions. And that's why I created my course, Learn Watercolor the Heart-Led Way. If something in you resonated with this demonstration of presence and play in watercolor, I would encourage you to consider joining us to go through the course Learn Watercolor the Heart-Led Way during the month of February. I have a special offer for you. Learn Watercolor the Heart-Led Way is a course that's available on my website at learn.angelafair.com. It's available all year round, but just for this 1 month, we'll be working together through the course in my Heart-Led Artist community. And when you enroll in the course today, or any time before, I think the 21st of February, we've kind of stretched the date out just to give you a little extra time. But if you enroll now, you can join in with all of the chatter about the course, share with the other students who are working through the course with us. We have a guest artist coming in February, and we're going to be talking about creative mindset, and we'll be just diving deeper into this whole process of learning technique in watercolor while also inviting your heart and your love and your sense of play to be part of the process. It's so exciting to me to be able to teach watercolor in a way that allows you to trust yourself and to make art your way. I never wanted to be an artist who shares all these rules that limit you, that make you feel restricted. The truth of the matter is, if you are painting, you are growing and you are learning. And if you are trusting yourself, then you're going to feel free to make your own unique art. So I would really encourage you with that. Robin's going to link the Learn the Watercolor the Heart-Led Way course enrollment page up in the chat and in the description below the video. So if you want to take this a step further, I've just shared a little glimpse of what you might find in the course today. And if you're itching to paint those figs, they're in the course as well. If you want to dive into negative painting those leaves, they're in the course as well. So the price is $99 US, and that does include that free month in the Heart-Led Artist community, which is a $30 bonus. Tomorrow, don't forget as we wrap up to sign up for our giveaway. First of all, there's a link in the description below the video. There are resource links. I know I talked about a lot of different supplies, and I'm going to answer your questions here in just a moment. Tomorrow's workshop is going to be is open to anybody. You're welcome to join us. We're going to be focusing on self-expression and style. This is ideal for any artist who's been painting for a while, and if you want to feel more confident to trust yourself. And if you've been trying to figure out what your personal style is, I'm going to share some of the obstacles that might be keeping you from freedom in self-expression and maybe robbing your painting practice of joy. So be aware of that. And join us tomorrow for that. And if you're just a beginner, you're welcome to join us for that as well. I'm going to be sharing some concepts that are going to help you get off to a really good start. I felt like I was really lost in this place of not being able to trust myself and thinking my paintings had to be perfect. I was stuck there for a really long time, and I would really like to see you find freedom sooner than I did. My core principle really is freedom, learning to love the process of making art and rejecting anything that feels like it's holding you back from that satisfaction you felt, when you first painted something that you thought was good. When we have that freedom, we let go of any guilt or shame we might be feeling about what we're doing or not doing. We just can't help but grow and really fall in love with what we do. And I love seeing that. I can't wait to show you some of the paintings that I've created that and how I understand my style, how my style has evolved over the years. So we'll be sharing all of that tomorrow. Okay, Robin has been collecting questions, and I have the feeling there might be a stack of them. So I'm just going to see if I can call up the list of questions here that she had for me. It was around here somewhere. Okay, Robin, I know you gave it to me. Where did it go? Document shared with you. That would be it. Okay, lots of questions. I'll just try to dive into them, and Robin's popping more in as I look. Oh my goodness. Okay, we had a question regarding the right or wrong side to watercolor paper. Like I mentioned, you can paint on both sides. With some of the brands that I use, I've noticed the sides can be slightly different, but it's not a dramatic enough difference to keep me from using them. There's only one brand I can think of that felt like it had two different sides, and I think they've actually changed that, so I don't even need to mention it. We had a question regarding watercolor and acrylic paintbrushes. Really good question. Sometimes you might find that at your local art supply store, there's not a lot for watercolor brushes. I have bought acrylic brushes and used them for watercolor. One thing you'll notice is that you want to buy the brushes with the shorter handles. Sometimes you'll see brushes that are for both acrylic or oil that have the really long handle. And I don't know, for watercolor, we use a shorter handled brush. And truthfully, I'm not even sure why, maybe just because of the size that we're using. One thing I didn't mention as well, and I'm just going to make sure the camera is catching my hands. There we go. When I am painting, most of the time I do not hold my brush clamped up down on the metal part of the brush, the ferrule. I'm going to hold it in the middle or at the end of the brush. I want a loose stroke, which is one reason I do that. When my hand is clamped down like this, I usually know that means I've gotten really tense and stiff in my body, and it's time to take a break. So I really pay attention to my body language when I'm painting, because it tells me a lot about my mindset and how I hold my brush is a part of that. Just regarding acrylic brushes, they're going to be very similar to a watercolor synthetic brush. So you can get away with using an acrylic brush for your watercolor, but you're going to get a much stiffer stroke. Some of that beautiful, soft, wide strokes that I was creating with my watercolor brush, they might be a struggle to do if your brush is a stiffer synthetic or acrylic brush. Okay, other questions. Opus Artist Quality Paint, Dennis asks about. Dennis, I don't think I've actually used it, so I can't really speak to their Artist Quality Paint. I'm not a huge fan of their watercolor paper, I'm afraid. Just feels a little bit like it has that slickness that I was talking about. More questions about watercolor brands. Stone Ground Paints from Regina. I've heard very good things about them, Angela, but I have not used them, so I can't speak for those. Sue asks if I'm ever concerned about toxins in paint. I really am not. As a watercolor artist, I'm really very rarely touching the paint, and I don't drink my paint water. I do try if I have a coffee. I keep it far from my water containers. I make sure, one thing I should mention, actually, I'll switch my camera over so I can show you. I always try to have my workflow the same way. So I'm left-handed, so my paint is on the left side, and my water is also on that side. I used to sometimes have my water on the right side, and then you get a wet brush, you dip it in your water, and then you bring it over to put it in your paint, and what do you think is going to happen? You're going to drip on your painting and make a stain. So I've really paid attention to the fact that my workflow happens on the left and my beverages happen on the right. And so when I have that consistent workflow, that definitely makes it easier for me to avoid getting any toxins in my coffee. Watercolor as well, we're using a very small amount of pigment. When I think about acrylic paint especially, you're often using larger quantities of pigment in your water and so forth. With watercolor, you're using such a small amount, we really don't have a lot of toxin concerns regarding that. And like putting toxins into our water supplies and so forth. There are, if you have a water supply that's going into your community, into your city, you might want to look into water disposal, different ideas for that. There are some different things you can do if you're concerned about putting that residue from your watercolor paint into your water supply. I live rurally. My water goes, yeah, it's not an issue here. But there was one other thing about watercolor or toxins is toxins are more of a concern when it comes to for an artist's health. When it comes to like powdered items, if you're working with pastels, there's particles, molecules in the air that you could be breathing in. So that's a concern. It's not a concern with watercolor because our pigment has been mixed with the binder, so it's not floating in the air. And the last thing about, yeah, we're not breathing in fumes either. So it's really one of the safest watercolor mediums. In fact, I have a video where I was kind of making fun about some of the dangers of being a watercolor artist. Our workers' comp is really very low. Our risk is low. So that's a good thing. We have, okay, Jan says, I have a Hahnemühle mixed media book of bamboo paper. It does mention watercolor, and I'm wondering if you have any experience with this paper. I have not used the Hahnemühle bamboo blend. I have used another brand that uses bamboo. You know, the best way to figure out if you want to use a paper for watercolor or not, have a really good piece of 100% cotton paper on hand and do your own product testing. When you buy that new sheet of paper or try that sample, you know, work with some flow, wet your paper, touch the color down, see how it moves in comparison to the 100% cotton. Look for whether or not it dries evenly. Look for how absorbent it is. And those things will tell you whether it will be a pleasure to work with or a pain. Oh, Tracy asks about surface sized. Oh, paper's so complicated. It's much more technical than I care to be, but paper, I have often noticed that my watercolor paper will sometimes say it's surface sized. Sometimes it will say it's surface and internally sized. It's all in, I think, their manufacturing process and how they apply the sizing to the paper. And I really can't speak for which one is better. In fact, I'm not 100% sure. I think a lot of it depends on the sizing and how much they're using as well. So it's just a really technical thing. At the end of the day, again, test it, compare it to what you have that you like. Is it favorable or not? So, you know, then the technical, how it's described doesn't matter so much as your own personal experience with how it works with your painting practice. Because it's a rabbit hole of technicality that we could go down into for a long time. Question about stretching the paper before painting. I do not stretch my paper before painting. If you're very, actually I can demonstrate it here, just a second. I'll switch the camera. Okay, so this painting that I was just painting on, you can see there, you might be able to see that some of the paper is a little bit raised or buckled as it's gotten wet. Now the whole paper didn't get wet, it was just over here was working with some moisture, and over here it's kind of gotten swollen with water and a bit raised, whereas here it's kind of gotten a little bit buckled. And as it dries, it flattens out again. Not perfectly, but most of the way. There are artists who really, really want a drum tight painting surface, and they will stretch their paper first. You can Google methods for stretching watercolor paper. I do not personally do it. because it's a lot of work and I really just want to start painting. So generally what I will do is just tape my paper down just the way I showed you. If it is a little buckled afterwards, more than I would like, maybe more than would be nice to frame, then I often will iron my paper. It's 100% cotton, so I can iron it just like a, I don't know, a bed sheet, and smooth it out so that it's easily, I can frame it easily. So that's just how I do it. And, you know, many different artists have different preferences about that. It's something for you to look into and see what you think. I just want to make painting fun. And for me, it's not fun to stretch my paper. I just want to start painting. And so that is the way that has worked for me so that I can feel really good about my painting process. Okay, questions about traveling with brushes. That's a great question, Annette. She asks what holder I use for my brushes. And I actually think I can grab it if you don't mind waiting a second. It's just so nice to have everything at arm's length here in my studio. When I'm traveling, I have to switch the camera again. When I'm traveling, I use this brush roll, and I just slide my brushes into it. It's got this little flap to protect the bristles, and then it just rolls up. And I've seen people make these from those bamboo placemats, or you can sew your own, or you can do it the easy way and just go shopping. So that's what I use. It works really quite well. Sometimes I just want to travel, and sometimes I just want to bring one brush, and then I have different pouches and I just throw the brush in. I don't worry about it too much. Most of my brushes are affordable enough that I don't mind traveling with them, and they might get a little bit more battered than they would if they're in the studio. It's not a big thing. Oh, Janet asks, Angela, if you were to do a painting with just 3 primary colors, which colors would you choose and which brand? I can't speak for brands, aside from just, I mean, I have mostly Daniel Smith, so that's here on hand. Blick Art Materials has a really nice some really nice primary hues. I really like the colors that would mimic what your computer printer ink cartridges would be. So a magenta, one of those nice bright yellows, and that cyan color. So those would be my 3 primaries. And I really like Sennelier's Cenarius Blue. And although, I think that's the one I would choose. Probably like a Hansa Yellow maybe, and the Quinacridone Magenta or a Quinacridone Rose. And that's probably what I would go for. But truthfully, I have those 3 in a little tiny micro palette, and most of the time I'd rather have more colors. The problem is if I'm traveling and I only have 3 colors, I'm often painting on location. And when I'm painting on location, my paints dry so fast that I want to have a bunch of colors. I want to have a few more colors, so I'm not fussing around mixing color. I actually think it's more convenient for my travel to have, 6 or 8 colors so that I can paint more quickly and spend less time mixing. How would you deal with mold in your palette? Great question. Daniel Smith recommends putting a drop or 2 of clove oil on a cotton ball and just tucking that into your palette. The only thing I would say about that is clove oil is quite strong. It can actually eat the plastic of your palette. So you want to make sure it's not touching those plastic surfaces. So put it somewhere where it's not going to burn through your palette. But apparently that works really well. Do I ever use masking fluid for white areas? Masking fluid is a popular option for many artists, but personally, it often creates crisp edges. I really think there's a lot of benefit in these wet and wet exercises where you have to plan which area stays light and just put less paint there. There's a beautiful softness that can happen when you leave your whites and just create those soft patterns of light value instead of using masking fluid to try to preserve them. masking fluid will create a very crisp edge. And there are some technical things that can happen that can damage your paper if you're not careful. So working with masking fluid is actually, it's a separate technique that I don't feel like fits within my style of everyday painting. Oh, another question about working wet on wet when it's very warm in your area. That's a great question. If things dry really fastly, you can tell I'm running out of time when my words stop working. If your paper dries too fast, there's a couple of things you can do. One is that you can run your whole piece of paper under running water, get it wet on both front and back, and then it will take longer to dry. You can also, and this I think is a really fascinating strategy, have a second piece of paper that you moisten and tape underneath the first, and that's going to extend your drying time even longer. I had a student send that tip in, and I just thought that was really fascinating. There are ways you can compensate for your hot, dry climate by bringing in that additional moisture layer. One thing I would also mention is if your climate is really humid. A friend of mine spent time in Thailand, and it was so humid there his paintings never seemed like they wanted to dry. There's a whole new watercolor strategy you have to develop to compensate for that humidity, and your style is going to evolve based on that as well. So it's really interesting how your climate can really affect your style of painting. Okay. Good questions. Oh, so many. Thank you so much for being so active and sharing these questions. Don't forget to enter the giveaway as well. The link is in the description of the video. If I'm losing people now during this Q&A, just don't forget to check out that description. It's full of great resources for you. Couple more questions and then we'll wrap up for the day, and I'll see you back here again tomorrow. Do I try to leave bits of white paper during my drills? I would say, Gail, that I always try to leave a path of light, and whether it's pure white or whether it's just a lighter value in contrast, I look for that pattern of light in my painting. And we really see that in the demos that I did today. This one here, you can see how it comes diagonally across the page. And this one here, it's a little more subtle. There's kind of 3 little white spots that we dance around between with as we look at the painting. And so I'm always looking for that path of light and where that's going to fall in my painting. Have I tried Rockwell or Yarka paints? I actually have just bought Rockwell recently. They have some very interesting colors. I haven't tried Yarka yet, but the Rockwell colors, it's the set that I bought is called the Magic Evolution 2 set, I think. And the colors, I'm going to show you tomorrow, but the colors are amazing. So I'm really enjoying that. And it is a Canadian company. The best way to look after watercolor tubes as they sometimes split. Do I reshape them, and how to best clean the cap? The only tip I would have for watercolor tubes, and I'll see if I can, where did I put my tubes? I'll demonstrate it here, is when you buy watercolor paint, I haven't had to reshape my tubes and I haven't experienced them splitting, but often when you open them, the change of air pressure will mean that they want to just ooze out. And watch that I've picked one that's, so they do want to ooze out a bit. And so, and this one's not going to do it because it's, live video. But if I wanted to clean the cap, I would just run it under hot running water, but if your paints do start to ooze out like this, what I do is I just turn it sideways so my fingers are on the sides, and then I squeeze, and that will suck it back down. And I learned that because I live in a dry northern climate and we use a lot of lotion. So that was a lotion trick that also applies to paint. Watercolor lessons are life lessons, people. Well, let's see here. I think that might be the end. I actually, one thing about watercolor, there's still a few more questions. One thing about watercolor tubes is I don't like to reshape them until I'm basically done using them. Usually I'll fill my palette 3 times from a tube of watercolor paint. And then for the very last one, that's when I'm going to start pushing the paint to the end of the tube or to the top of the tube. Because if you're always squeezing it up to the top, you're going to take the lid off and it's going to want to splurt out. So I like to have a little more control over how fast it comes out of the tube. MK says, I heard ceramic or porcelain mixing areas are better than plastic. Is that true? I have both, and I guess the ceramic wouldn't stain as much. The plastic ones do tend to stain a little bit, but that's really the only difference that I can think of. And it doesn't really bother me if they're a little bit stained. It's life. Things get dirty. The travel paintbrush holders I am seeing are big. What kind do I have? That is a good question, and I don't know if I have the answer. I've had this for probably 15 years. They just don't wear out. So I'm afraid I can't tell you, but I can show you. There's a little logo on it, and so if you really want to get your detective hat on, you could try to figure out what that logo is. Okay, Kristen asks, I've got 2 more questions and then we're going to be done. Kristen asks, have I ever tried watercolor flow medium to enhance your color flow? And if you're using student grade materials, would that help to make it work better? That is a good question. Firstly, I've only used watercolor flow medium like once, and I didn't really feel like it made a big difference. If you want your watercolors to flow more, a really good tip is to buy watercolor made by Core. Their Aquazol binder just has this beautiful whoosh when you touch it into a wet wash, and you got flow. That's a good question. The thing I would do to make my paint flow the best is to buy the 100% cotton paper. It just seems like it's the surface that makes the biggest difference. If you're using student grade watercolor paint, the problem isn't usually, if you're dissatisfied with that paint at all, it's usually because the color's not as bright as the artist quality paint. And so that's the main difference. Actually, I recommend if you have student grade watercolor paint, feel free to use it as much as you want until you start craving richer colors. And that's when you want to start slowly adding some artist grade paint to your palette. So that's just something to keep in mind. And Cheryl asks, finally, this is a great place to stop. Do you have a picture in mind when you are doing your underpainting? Generally, I have in my head maybe an approximate, like an unformed vision, a path of light, like I mentioned. Maybe I'm thinking of a diagonal shape with gold and green alongside of it. Then I know I'm moving toward a floral. It depends. I like doing warm-ups, just like the wet and wet painting I did today. I like doing some where I have an idea in mind what I would like it to become. And I like doing some where I let the first brush stroke inform the next one and just flow out from there. Working with both of those outcomes is really good exercise for me. Sometimes I try to create something that started with a vision. Sometimes I let the painting tell me. So it's just fun to build skill in both of those areas. Okay, again, we have resource links, so many, in the description below the video. Please do take advantage of those. Robin and I have gone to a lot of work sourcing products, product listings, links to where you can buy Hahnemühle paper, links to some of the different sites we shop from, and resources for you. Learn Watercolor the Heart-Led Way is another great resource I really want to share with you. This course was so exciting to create. I realized I could teach watercolor, beginning watercolor, in a different way than anyone else was doing. And it was so exciting to realize that I could help you exercise your ability to trust your own internal vision as you were learning beginner techniques. I mean, that's amazing. You don't have to wait to be good to develop your personal style. And that's really what Learn Watercolor the Heart-Led Way is all about. If you are learning watercolor, want to grow stronger in technique, and feel free to trust yourself. That is the place for you. If you are an intermediate artist, I hope you'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk more about personal style. Once you get some techniques under your belt, you have more of your brain freed up to think about your self-expression. And we're going to talk about what's contained in that whole development process and how you can coach yourself to become your own favorite artist. It's something I love to teach because it made such a powerful difference for my art journey. And I can't wait to talk about it tomorrow, so I hope you'll be back. Thank you, everyone. Oh, I'm out of words. I'm out of water. I'm out of cough drops. It's time to wrap up for the day. One thing I'm not out of is excitement over this beautiful medium of watercolor. I actually think once I turn the camera off, I'm going to go do some more painting. So do come back and join us tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. Let me find that off button. Okay, bye for now.